تحية للجميع في هذا اللقاء الذي أعتقد أنه توقيته يعني لا يكون أفضل من ذلك.
This is a very important timely gathering. In 1979, Russia, then the Soviet Union, intervened in Afghanistan. It was the end of the Soviet Union and its history. In 1990, the United States intervened in the heart of the Islamic world, and there was a beginning of the new history, and Thomas Hobbes talked about this. Now, Russia is intervening, the US is intervening, Iran is also intervening, and several powers that were the result of the previous interventions in Afghanistan and in Kuwait and in Iraq. And this might be different this time. So John the Baptist talked about the Armageddon battle, which is the end of the world. So maybe we can talk about this. I know that some of the speakers today have a lot to say. Maybe the end of times is near, and maybe we should keep our words brief, and maybe 10 to 12 minutes for each speaker, and then we will start with Dr. Victor Mizin, who is currently leading researcher in the Moscow State Institute of International Affairs. He is also a deputy director of the Institute for the International Studies of the MGIMO. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much for inviting us and me to this important event. I think that despite the evident divergences, which are unavoidable probably on such issues, it's very important that we have this dialogue and exchange of views, especially that Syria now is becoming almost a domestic issue in Russia. And I think that unfortunately everybody knows everything in Russia about Syria, and there's a lot of talk shows, interviews. If we start from assessing the background, fortunately or unfortunately, the Syrian case has long ago transcended its regional framework, becoming an important international issue. And despite prior expectations in Moscow, it has further exacerbated already strained relations between my country and the West, which have been poisoned after the well-known Ukrainian crisis standoff. So this rift is widening. Why Russian foreign policy major goal, I think, it's to avoid isolation and to present Russia as a major global player. So the views are so divergent, which was, I think, brilliantly underscored by the previous speaker. So while Moscow is, objectively actually supporting Assad's regime, though it's officially declining it, both diplomatically and militarily, as its traditional ally and rampart in the geopolitically very important region for Moscow, and as it's said in my country, the only viable political and military force. Other actors call him a bloody dictator who caused all the problems, wave of violence, all misgivings for his own people, and even hasn't stopped before using the chemical weapons against them. At the same time, Moscow is accusing certain regional players, I'm afraid, including your country, in directly aiding the ISIL, which it sees as a major terrorist threat of today and other associated terrorist groupings, and it strongly criticized the Western position, at least for dragging foot, if not assisting the ISIL on the ground. The Western states, in their turn, charge that Russia, as it was said before, is advancing its own vested interests, while, for example, as it's said in NATO, 90 to 80% of all airstrikes are addressed not against ISIL, but against some opponents of Assad's regime. Russia also vehemently opposes Ashton Carter and the Pentagon speaker's statements that what Russia is doing in Syria is a fundamental strategic mistake. So many observers now comply that Moscow sees its current policy in Syria as a demonstration of a new Russian restored almost great power status. Its return to this strategically important region, where its actual involvement in the fight against terrorism is promoting Russian national interests, because according to Russian intelligence sources, 2,500 ISIL fighters are coming from former Soviet states, and 1,200 only from Russia. And many of them are returning to Russia to plan some terrorist activities and are apprehended there on the ground. So this suggests that a rather energetic policy of Russia here, because what's needed for Moscow is a clear-cut success, not fiasco, as it has been the case in Afghanistan in the 80s. So we will see that the Russian air group here will be augmented, that we'll see the new intensity of air sorties, which are stepped up and coming to the intensity of NATO mission flown by coalition in '99 against Serbia. So how long it will last, in my view, probably for 3-4 coming months, though in recent days we saw a certain scaling down due to ground operation of the Syrian army, and all depends how it develops on the ground, and then probably it will evolve to other format, and it's to be determined, of course, by the Russian leadership. And of course, this is despite the obvious risks for Russia. First, the lack of tangible military success could be detrimental to Moscow's prestige internationally for its geopolitical standing, also in the region. Second, it could prod ISIL, notwithstanding its current losses against Russian strikes, to expand their operation in the region, making them more agile and, so to say, more innovative, and we already observe it. Currently, many groups, terrorist groups, according to Russian intelligence, are already trying to unite their operations. Third, ISIL could turn to so-called asymmetrical response against the European and Russian homelands, especially that Moscow views Syria as only spearhead for ISIL to expand its terrorist operations to new foreign states in the future. And of course, it's prognosticated risk what could happen if some Russian pilots are shot down on the over the territory controlled by ISIL, or what will happen if ISIL attacks Russian bases or base in Syria, in Hamadain. At the same time, Russian leaders strongly decline any possibility of the ground operations because the reminiscences of Afghanistan are still very clinging in Russian heads. So it leads to intensification of Russian operation once again in support of Syrian army, which, according to Russian media, is enhancing its pressure on the terrorism. There are very interesting new novelties like Russian, Iraqi, Iranian, Syrian coordination center in Baghdad, which is very useful for exchange of information. And there are some signals in Moscow that Moscow would be ready even to extend its operation to Iraqi airspace, although it is strongly opposed by United States in Britain. So in this situation, when we need, as we all agree, I think, especially with our Western counterparts, that when we need a united front against terrorism to neutralize this terrible threat to our national security, we see that we are all divided, and more than that, we are engaged in a fervent war of words, reminding for me the Cold War days. The explanation of this, I think, is quite understandable, because the approaches of Moscow and many Western states to the international affairs are quite different. Why Russia adheres to so-called classical understanding of international law, which, as Mr. Putin many times stated, is based on the principles of national sovereignty or the state control over its territory, when nobody could interfere in its domestic affairs. It only could be done by the United Nations Security Council, according to Article 7 of United Nations chapter. The position of Western states is quite different what Russia criticized and observed in the past, especially in the rump Yugoslavia, and Iraq and Afghanistan. And we know now that there are the ideas that if the crimes of genocide or if the abuse of human rights is committed, the outside powers have the right to interfere to save the people from slaughtering. We know that the concepts of responsibility to protect are winning more and more supporters in the West. This collision of approaches to international law, to international affairs, is also instigated by the obvious difference of attitude to basic principles and ideas of what democracy and governance is and how the state or the economy should be operated. And I think it was first evident during the famous speech of Mr. Putin in 2007 in Munich, and quite recently the 70th session of United Nations General Assembly. If in Munich Mr. Putin told the West that there's no need to play God and solve all these people's problems, this year he said, "Do you at least realize now what you've done?" while concluding, "But I am afraid this question will remain unanswered because they have never abandoned their policy, which is based on arrogance, exceptionalism, and impunity." Simultaneously, Moscow, at least semi-officially, is trying to formulate its own concept of so-called enlightened conservatism, which it confronts to alleged Western decadence, loss of moral and spiritual values. And some people in Moscow elite think that Russia has enough soft power to attract sympathy and support all those in the world, and specifically in Muslim Ummah, who oppose the so-called American quest for global domination, its aggressive attempts to interfere in internal affairs of sovereign states under the pretext of democratization. What the Moscow experts term like interfering without taking no account of the will, aspirations, historical tradition, and situation on the ground, rights and beliefs of the local population. Thus, and it's very important, I think it's the thrust of my presentation, Syrian crisis is not becoming just another conflict in a remote foreign country, but for Russia, a showcase of new self-assertive Russian foreign policy and new foreign ideology, which firmly withstands any pressure or mentoring from outside. And Russia claims that, unlike US-led coalition, it acts in Syria in complete compliance with the norms and principles of international law and upon the request of the legitimate and popular elected government. This once again leads to protracted information war in which Russia is strongly accused by Washington and several regional states of neo-imperialist policies, aid to bloody Assad's regime, and causing casualties to innocent civilian population. So some experts in Moscow even warn of the danger of imminent new Cold War. At the same time, I'm optimistic, and I think that consensus can be found if there's enough political will and wisdom. And we, in Moscow, we see that even US position, and of course United States is a major player in the region, is becoming slightly more flexible in recent days. So Washington doesn't demand an immediate demise of Assad and admits the possibility of his temporary participation in the process of stabilization, despite what was said by the previous speaker. Of course, there are diverging views where this process could commence simultaneously with the continuation of airstrikes. I think that actually more substantial successes on the ground are to be reached before we launch a future mechanism of national pacification and state rebuilding in Syria. Recently also have been very interesting signals from European Commission, from Madam Mogherini, and from NATO leaders that Moscow theoretically could play a constructive role in the settlement of Syrian crisis. And I think both Russia and the United States are interested in stopping the ISIL expansion in the region and beyond. And we already have a rather positive precedent of destructing the Syrian chemical weapons arsenal, although this endeavor hasn't led to any further advancement. So there are signals that some consensus with US side could be found. We now know that the talks between Mr. Lavrov and Kerry are underway. And while Moscow is strongly pressing that the Assad's immediate disappearance from the political scene, which some people demand probably in this audience, could only create a political vacuum which the undesirable forces could feel. So Moscow now is shows its readiness to support the idea of transition government, which has never been the case before, and is actively contacting some representative of Syrian opposition. So I think if the ideas of Geneva III process, which have been put forward by Mr. de Mistura, special representative of Syria, or any new contact group are not probably flying, we can think of devising something like a Big Six format, probably along the lines of very successful Iranian nuclear issue, Big Six, that for me could include United States, Russia, some European Union representatives, Turkey, and certain Gulf states with probable engagement of Jordan. So I would like to end my presentation with the idea that despite all the divergences of views, it's very important that the dialogue is underway, and that I believe that compromise can be found, as it has been the case in the dark days of Cold War. If we turn to, book by Mr. Kissinger's of World Order, the most difficult crisis, and Indochina and Middle East, for that matter, have come to a very positive settlement when the consensus has been found. Because I strongly believe that nobody in this room, nobody of regional or global actors wants a new black hole of instability and terrorism. And of course, the Moscow idea at least tactically is completely, as it was stated by the head of Mr. Putin's staff, is complete elimination of ISIL to prevent those militants, those rebels coming back and commit terrorist acts in Russia. So Moscow strongly wants to revive its cooperation with the West and become an important regional player. That's why what has been said once again by the President Speaker, we have very good relations now with certain Arab states, including Egypt, Jordan, and so on, even ongoing contacts with such important, I'm not mentioning Iranian friends, but such important actors like Saudi Arabia. So what we want to achieve, it's a more peaceful, more stable Middle East, which geopolitically is in the interest of Moscow. And if one speaks about the lack of strategy for Russia, I think it was officially stated, it's creating the most positive international environment which would be propitious for Russian development and modernization. And of course, the Middle East being so close, adjacent to Russian southern borders, is geopolitically a very important area for us. Thank you for your attention, and of course, I'm ready to answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mizin. I think that was a good insight in the thinking of the Kremlin, which apparently nobody else shares. But I'll now turn to Sergei Strokan.
الكلمة للسيد سيرجي ستروكان who is Russian he will be speaking about Russian intervention in Syria, pros and cons.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, colleagues, I think all of us have to agree that in the world tens and tens of seminars are held, and really, frankly speaking, not all of them are worth visiting. But this event, what we see today, and I want to compliment the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies for this very rare opportunity to share our views on the developments which are highly controversial, highly dramatic, but obviously which would shape up probably not only the face of the Middle East, but the new global order. Because what is at stake is not only what will happen to Syria, but who will set the rules of the game, what would be do's and don'ts in international politics, and how national interests of the countries would clash, overlap, and probably would pave the way for some compromises which Mr. Mizin was referring to. So the life is changing and the international politics are changing very fast. So my presentation, which I have submitted actually for the conference, was written just days before sensational visit of President Assad to Moscow. Physically, I didn't have a chance to make last-minute changes in the report itself. So before I come to presentation, very briefly, I will just share with you my feelings by points, how I see this visit, how I interpret this visit, because now what we see, the war of interpretations, we are flooded with comments, which some are confusing, some are irrelevant, some sound like a half-truth. So the first point, as I see it, and those experts I was talking to in Moscow, whether someone likes it or not, by not only inviting President Assad to Moscow, but by making visit maximum public, but there was a lot of publicity of the visit. President Putin sent the world a clear message that President Assad, whether someone likes it or not, is still considered by Moscow as a privileged partner. He's not going anywhere, at least in foreseeable future, and Moscow doesn't like the talks of Assad to step down in coming weeks and months. So the second point is that was a strong signal to Iranians, who at one point were seriously afraid that Moscow would dump Assad. So now as the signal is sent, it seems that the other outcome of this meeting would be whether someone likes it or not, further strengthening of what we can describe as Russian-Iranian alliance in the region. Third point is that that was a signal to the West in that geopolitical chess game that Moscow wants to send a clear message that all decisions in the Middle East, which are not restricted to Syria only, from this point would be taken with the consideration of Moscow's aspiration. At least this is how Moscow sees it. And now let me come to my presentation itself, which is entitled Russia's War on Terror, Pros and Cons, and which is just an attempt to see what changes Russia's operation in Syria, which started less than a month, September 30, is bringing to the world. So 4 weeks after the launch of Russia's airstrikes on targets inside Syria, which are dated back to September 30, the motives of Russia's military operation remain the subject of ongoing debate, which has split policymakers, diplomats, and expert community into two opposite camps. While some regard Russia's move as a genuine effort seen as a part of Moscow's own war on terror, others suspect President Putin of pursuing a secret agenda in the Middle East, which is aimed at eradicating moderate Syrian opposition and keeping President Assad's crumbling regime afloat while making a lot of propaganda drum beating of a notorious fight against Islamic terrorists. As Russian official propaganda describes it, the basic motive behind Russia's airstrikes in Syria is to meet terrorists in the neighboring region, preventing them from coming at Russia's doorstep, as Mr. Mizin was pointing out, and coming to ex-Soviet republics, which are also seen as, let us be frank, Russia's southern backyard. However, this notion seemingly looks unconvincing for the West and vast part of the Arab world, including Gulf monarchies. The confusion starts with the definition itself. What some describe as Russia's action in Syria as military intervention, others see it as an attempt to forge a joint global alliance against ISIS, the way international anti-terrorist coalition was forged in 2001 in Afghanistan following September 11 attacks. So where is the truth? Where is the truth? One thing is clear. Russia's airstrikes on targets inside Syria have raised the stakes in Moscow's policy of trying to engage the West in what is described by Moscow as a joint fight against Islamic terrorists. It is also sending confusing signals over the possibility of re-engaging the West in a multifaceted cooperation from political dialogue to trade, which is severely handicapped by the war of sanctions. The negative reaction of the Western leaders so far, which is echoed by condemnation in vast parts of Sunni world, showed that the hopes for a wider coalition against what Moscow describes as fighting ISIS faded in thin air. Expectations that the common enemy, presenting a civilized challenge, would bring Russia and Western coalition into one camp proved to be at least premature. Let us be frank. Despite a barrage of Western criticism aimed at Russia's attacks allegedly targeting the Syrian opposition, Russia's military officials strongly deny that they are targeting Syrian opposition. They insist that the airstrikes are effective so far. And as we've seen in recent weeks, that's really another dramatic development. Against such a display of Russia's activity, President Obama announced a strategic plan to launch a general offensive on the de facto capital of ISIS, which is the city of Raqqa, deploying 20,000 Kurdish fighters and some 5,000, if I'm not mistaken, rebels, which are presenting the Syrian coalition, and this operation would be conducted with US Air Force support. So Obama's initiative to launch major offensive on ISIS position is aggravated the rift between Moscow and Washington, and it cannot dispel the suspicion that it is regarded as a show of resolution and competence for the sake of what we can describe as not to be outdone by Russians. So on its part, the second coalition in making, we can say openly about this, which is comprising Russia, Iran, Iraq, along with Damascus, is showing its own resolve to emerge as a new force in the whole play. As you know, they have already set up a coordination center in Baghdad to do reconnaissance and analysis, which has come on streams in recent weeks. And what is interesting that Iraq is a newcomer to this coalition, and for Moscow this is extremely important because, as you know, Iraq was initially seen as US client state after the demise of Saddam Hussein regime. At least that was an initial idea. And now we see that more than a decade after US military presence in Iraq, Baghdad has suddenly pledged to become more active in alliance with Russia, providing intelligence data to Russia and Iran and Syria. Meanwhile, the feedback reaction to Russia's military actions ranges from total rejection, Saudi Arabia and Turkey, to cautious admittance of possible cooperation, well, probably France, some European countries, and neglect attitudes, which is adopted in some parts of the Arab world. Basically, the undeclared competition between the two coalitions would determine not so much the winner of the battle of global evil, which is described as ISIS, but the new pecking in the region itself. For the United States, it is becoming a matter of reinstating its credential as the time-honored provider of security for the Middle East. For Russia, it is about securing a pro-Moscow regime in Damascus, fomenting privileged relations with the rising regional power, Iran, and also coming back into global politics as an assertive actor to be reckoned with. Despite this drastic discrepancy in strategic interests, the overarching goal for both is evident. ISIS has no place in the civilized world. What is also interesting, probably this event was bypassed, surprisingly bypassed by Western media, was a visit, blitz visit to Moscow by Saudi defense minister, sorry, visit to Sochi. This is Russian city of Sochi, as you know, by Saudi defense minister Sheikh Mohammed bin Salman. He met, President Putin. That was a blitz visit, which was not confirmed till the latest moment, and it seems that was an attempt just to test Putin's intention on resolving the Syrian quagmire. From my point of view, the visit was a sensational turnaround because, as you know, Saudi Arabia and Russia came at odds over Syria for 4 years. And nothing has changed then, let us be frank, with the exception of a suspicion that the two nations are conducting a proxy war on the Syrian battlefield. Given the support which is rendered by Saudi Arabia to a Syrian opposition, the trip of the son of the Saudi king was a daring enterprise by itself, and in fact, that was not his first visit to Russia this year, because we've seen him at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum in June this year. During that time, there was a lot of talk about doing trade and looking for investment opportunities in Russia. So this time, apart from probing Moscow's resolution in backing the ruler of Damascus, Sheikh Salman sought the answer to the crucial question for the Desert Kingdom. What are the limits to cooperation between Russia and Saudi arch-rival Iran? Actually, channels of communication remained open, and the appreciation of Riyadh that is being pursued into a corner by the new realignment in the region was seemingly alleviated. Let me just quote you what Saudi Foreign Minister Adel Al-Jubeir said. This is a quote. "We expressed our concerns that this operation could be regarded as an alliance between Iran and Russia. But in the conversation, our Russian friends explained to us that the main aim is the fight with Daesh and terrorism. End of the quote. The meeting between President Putin and Sheikh Salman, according to Russia's Foreign Minister Lavrov, also produced a verbal consent to pursue common goals in Syria. And this is also important. And I was really surprised that post factum, Russia's Foreign Minister Lavrov sounded unexpectedly optimistic. He claimed that Moscow and Riyadh shared the goal of, let me quote again, ensuring the triumph of national reconciliation in Syria so that all Syrians, regardless of their nationality or religion, will feel masters of their land. Of course, this a bit assessment could be misleading, since until now the two actors in the Syrian drama have divergent interpretations of who are described by those all Syrians. Nevertheless, the positive outcome of the meeting in Sochi cannot be discounted, because now everyone started talking about a political solution. And as Lavrov pointed out, Russia calls on, let me quote, all external players who can influence political processes in Syria to promote the soonest launch of a nationwide dialogue in Syria. To mitigate concerns of Saudi Arabia that Russia airstrikes are targeting mostly anti-Assad rebels, Moscow has offered to establish close cooperation between military command centers and security services in order, as Lavrov said, to eliminate any doubts that the targets of the Russian air forces are ISIS militants, Al-Nusra Front, and other terrorist organizations. So one thing is clear: Bashar Assad is a formidable stumbling block. Thank you. Let me quote another prominent Russian historian, Professor Georgy Mirsky, who is one of the leading experts on the Middle East and Russia, who is certain that neither side can abandon its rigid stand. Moscow cannot dump Assad because it would be equated to admittance that it has been supporting for 4 years the wrong person.
14.
Yes, Riyadh is fixed on toppling Assad for the sake of long-born plans to see alternative regime in Damascus. So since the Middle East is undergoing one of the most dramatic upheavals in its history, which is marked by reconfiguration and realignment of its major players, nothing could be excluded. Let us be frank. At one point, going eastward for Russia might mean positive engagement in joint enterprises and endeavors of Saudi Arabia, its competitor on the global oil market, and still its opponent in Syrian conflict. Thank you. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. I think this is very amazing. What I conclude from the view from Moscow is that Syria is not the important thing. It is Russian new power, and that Russia wants to use Syria to blackmail the world in accepting its position as a central actor, and then it accepts everybody to cooperate nicely in this.
جديد مايكروفون رجاء microphone. Our next speaker is Mr. Marwan Kabalan, Associate Researcher at the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies, and he is one of the organizers of this conference. I would like to begin by thanking you all. The title of my intervention is beyond an historicization of the moment. I would like to explain what I mean by this, actually. I have noticed that our role as researchers and academics, regardless of our emotional link to the Syrian crisis, that was until recently the description of what's happened or what's currently happening at the Syrian level, and the title of our work so far has been failure in expecting the Russian military intervention in Syria, and I think it is one of a series of failures that we have faced as researchers in expecting very important and key events at the Arab and regional level throughout the previous years. For example, we failed to expect the Arab Spring revolutions, although we had noticed the presence of factors that could lead to such revolutions, maybe because we had not believed in the capacity of the people of this region to do this revolution. We failed to see the rise of ISIL and the fall of Mosul in Iraq, maybe because we did not understand the level of frustration of the Sunnis of Iraq from the policies that were based on denominations and sectarianism during his rule of Iraq, during al-Maliki's rule of Iraq for the 8 years. We also failed to expect the reaction of the world towards what's happening in Syria, because we had an excessive belief in the values of the world in the 21st century. We have faced a series of failures. We have become historians, or we only describe what's happening in the regional or in the region. This is why the title, as you can see in the booklet, is Beyond a Historicization of the Moment. This is what I meant by this. Maybe you would like to go again to try and expect and project what's going to happen in the region. I think that we failed to project the military Russian intervention in Syria was because we focused mainly on Syria. And Dr. Azmi and our Russian colleagues mentioned that Russia or Syria was not the key factor that led Vladimir Putin to intervene, and our focus on this region without understanding the different perspective, so understanding the motives of the actors was very important. I will start to talk about the agent structure debate in order to try and understand why the Russians intervened suddenly, or we were surprised to see his intervention in Syria. We should have focused. So we should not only determine the Russian interests in Syria. We talked about the military base in Tartus, and we talked about military contracts between the Syrian regime and Russia, the protection of the minorities, etc. But we did not give particular attention to the role of the actor and these interventions that led to the military intervention in Syria. I will be talking on Mr. Putin, the worldview, and the agent structure that I have talked about. We should understand that Mr. Putin and the Russian oligarch is in principle against revolution. They regard the people as subjects, and the revolution might lead or will eventually lead to chaos. This vision of Putin and the ruling elite drive them to be, in principle, against any revolution. In addition to that, it is very important to understand that Mr. Putin considers that the revolutions that took place, starting the revolution in Georgia in 2003, and then in 2004 in Georgia, and in 2005, were all supported by the West, and they wanted to isolate Russia. And this is why Mr. Putin read the Arab Spring this way, because he considered that this is an extension of these colored revolutions. This is why he was in principle against this Arab Spring. Mr. Putin explained the demonstrations in 2011 that oppose him as against him in person, and he considered that the West was trying to move the spring, the revolutions to Russia. And we all remember talking about financing the rallies in Moscow, opposing Mr. Putin, and all the blame was cast on the West in this case. So I will be talking about the world views of Mr. Putin. He faces, or he is frustrated when it comes to his experience with the West, especially the administration of Barack Obama, who did not take him seriously. And this frustration or disappointment, let's say, this disappointment was after the failure of the reset policy. We all remember the meeting in 2009 between Hillary Clinton and Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. They pressed a button to relaunch this relationship that suffered from deep gap during the rule of Mr. Bush. Mr. Putin had hoped that the U.S. administration will change its policy vis-à-vis Russia regarding the missiles in Eastern Europe, or taking into account Russian interests. However, Putin later discovered that all what Mr. Obama wanted to do by this reset policy was to pave the way for his return from Afghanistan. We know that the supply chains of the U.S. were bombarded by Taliban in Afghanistan through Pakistan. He needed this way, and the Russians provided him with this alternative way after this meeting that took place between foreign ministers Clinton and Lavrov. Putin also feels very disappointed after Ukraine. We know that the West isolated or tried to isolate Mr. Putin after the annexation of Crimea, and I think it has played a major role in forming the perspective of Mr. Putin of the West. He feels, Mr. Putin feels nostalgia towards the Soviet Union. We know that he was a member of the intelligence services in the Soviet Union, and we know that he has said that the fall of the Soviet Union is the biggest calamity, the biggest strategic catastrophe in the world, and he expressed his view in 2007 in Munich, the first conference of security. Also, when it comes to Mr. Putin's perspective of the world, I think that the democracies are united in principle. Dictatorships as well find themselves supporting each other. This is why I feel that Mr. Putin feels more comfortable with rulers who are more similar to him. This is regarding Mr. Putin, and I think it was very important to highlight these points in order to understand that we'll try to seize any opportunity in order to achieve this self-recognition and maybe revenge, because I think that mainly the military intervention in Syria reflected Putin's desire to avenge what happened in Ukraine and the treatment of the West throughout the previous years. Regarding the structure of the international system, I think that it pushed Putin to do these things. We know that the U.S. does not or doesn't have the will to have direct interventions in the Middle East, and this has led to this vacuum that we could talk about that leveraged the competition at the regional level. And of course, there was an internal conflict in a key state in this world. So we have several layers when it comes to this structure of the regional and international system. The US is not intervening. There was a vacuum. Some of the regional players tried to fill this vacuum. There was an internal conflict in one key state, and it has become a regional conflict in an area that is very troubled. I think that these factors played a key role in pushing Mr. Putin to intervene. If we talk about the structure, this regional structure, we can say that Putin has or sees four competing forces to fill this gap or this vacuum that was left after the withdrawal of the US. So Iran has gotten the project of an empire, Turkey as well. Israel has its own project as well, but it has a different status. It doesn't have any major allies in Syria. This is why it is seizing opportunities every now and then to directly intervene to protect its interests and achieve its goals. And we have Saudi Arabia, and its project is preventing others, especially Iran, of gaining benefits. These are the major four forces in this regional conflict. How is Russia's relationship with these forces? And I think it played a major role in this intervention. When it comes to Saudi Arabia, there's some rivalry. We have a historical problem, ideological problem, the alliance of the Saudi Arabia with the West, and also Saudi Arabia is a big competitor when it comes to the oil market. Of course, Saudi Arabia agreed with the US to keep on pumping oil, and this has kept the oil prices low. And we know that Russia's losses from the falling of the oil prices is bigger than the losses after the crisis, the military crisis that faced before. Turkey is a very major competitive at the regional level. It is an emerging economy. It would have been a major player had the revolutions, the Arab Spring revolutions succeeded, especially in Egypt. It would have affected Russian interests in the region, in addition to its capacity to have a relationship through the Syrian corridor that allows Syria, or that allows Turkey to have relationships with all these regions. The relationship with Iran is very complicated. Iran is an ally from one side and facing Islamic Sunni movements. However, on the other hand, Iran is a competitor. If Iran succeeds in controlling Iraq, because Iraq has major oil reserves, and if Iran manages to control Iraq, it will become a political and economic giant, and especially if its relationship with Washington improved. Israel, it is an ally of Russia, maybe the only state to be the ally. Russia does not have any form of problems with Israel. So with Iran, there's a complicated relationship. It's an ally and a competitor. However, with Israel, Israel is an ally. There are common interests like the hostility towards the Islamic movements, and Israel prefers the presence of the Assad regime, and Moscow tends to support non-democratic regimes in the region. So these were, or this structure highly influenced the military intervention in Syria. As to the relationship vis-a-vis the world system, it was very tense with the US administration during the rule of George W. Bush. Putin lost Ukraine, the Orange Revolution, you can remember the Orange Revolution, and the relationship worsened after the war of Georgia in 2008, the expansion of the NATO, and the missiles in Eastern Europe. As I have said previously, Putin had hoped that the relationship would improve during or with the Obama administration. the result was not that positive. Russia joined the World Trade Organization. In addition to that, the United States continued with the missile project and the Eastern European countries, and then there was the Edward Snowden case, and so you have 2 minutes. And the Libyan case played a major role in determining the position of Russia vis-à-vis Syria. When it comes to the context of intervention in Syria, it was a revenge in a susceptible environment that would allow President Putin to retaliate. And Putin had lost Ukraine and then won it back in 2010 after his allies went back to power in 2010. He lost it again, and I think that Ukraine is far more important than Syria to Russia. It played a major role in determining the position that led to a military intervention in Syria. We remember that President Putin and Obama, during the St. Petersburg summit, the G20 summit, agreed to dismantle the chemical weapons of Syria. It was a way to avoid a military strike against Assad. I think that Putin felt that it was a major diplomatic success. However, he didn't know that the Iranian allies were in secret negotiations with the Americans. This is why Mr. Obama agreed to this chemical agreement, because they didn't want to influence the negotiations in Moscow. After this, there was an agreement between Mr. Putin and Mr. Obama to hold Geneva 3 and to find a solution to the Syrian crisis by exerting pressure on the allies. For example, Russia would exert pressure on Assad and the US on the opposition, and there was a major agreement between Foreign Minister Lavrov and Foreign Minister Kerry. However, the fall of Ukraine changed everything. President Putin had a partial response because he had lost Ukraine. He wanted to gain it back, so he invaded Crimea and annexed it, and then he didn't execute the Paris Agreement and Geneva 2, and then he imposed this new military situation by encouraging the Syrian regime towards a military solution, and he also recognized the results of the presidential elections held in June 2014 by the Syrian regime. I think that the way towards the intervention in 2015 started with the improving relationship between Saudi Arabia and Turkey that changed the situation on the ground. The opposition had a lot of gains in 2015 after the death of King Abdullah, and we saw that the regime was falling. The opposition, the Islamic opposition, was on the rise. There was a signature of the nuclear agreement with Iran and an agreement between Turkey and the US to create a secure zone free of ISIS and the regime. All of this made or was key to the intervention of Russia in Syria. President Putin undoubtedly tried to achieve a series of goals. We noticed that after every intervention of Putin, his popularity increases in Russia. And I think this is one of the Russian psyche, one of the elements of the Russian culture. The people support any president who restores the position of Russia in the world, even if it's at the cost of the economic and standards of living. Some polls show that the people support Putin. 90% of the Russian people support Putin. I think that Mr. Putin gives particular attention to his popularity in Russia, also to change the balance of position on the ground in order to have the suitable factor for this agreement imposed by the Russians. I think it put an end to all of the intervention, regional intervention in Syria. For example, the Turks will not be able to create the secure zone. The regime will stay, and other objectives were achieved. Russia has become a major actor in Syria. I think there will be no solution in Syria but through the Russian gate, because Putin is the shot caller regarding the situation in Syria. It put an end to any agreement between Iran and the US that doesn't take into account the Russian interests, and it was like a strike back against the US administration after Ukraine. It was a preemptive strike against the Islamists, which is a main factor, and he restored the position of Russia at the international world without having to pay a big price, in contrast to what happened in Ukraine. So the Americans did not take any measures when it comes to the Russian intervention in Syria, in contrast with what happened after the intervention in Ukraine. Russia is no longer isolated. The West is listening to Russia, and it happened during the General Assembly of the United Nations, the 70th. There was the first meeting between Obama and Putin after St. Petersburg summit in 2013. Russia is leading World Alliance. Is there an exit strategy? I will be concluding by this. I don't know whether Mr. Putin has an exit strategy. There are two possibilities. Either he would use the military presence in Syria to push towards a political solution with the regional and key world powers. We have seen this in Vienna, and or the major opponents of Russian intervention would change the situation on the ground. Thank you for your good listening.
Thank you. The questions raised by this intervention is how this intervention explains the contradiction between the Putin policies that is against any foreign interventions and its own intervention in Syria.
I'm going to take a number of questions, and then, because we are running out of time, yes, over there. Just, somebody has got mics? No? Just try to speak up.
All right. Just two elements to my Russian colleagues here. I'm from Pakistan, the leader, and I covered Afghanistan and some of the Middle East crisis. I covered conflict more. One thing that Russian president's popularity increased ever since he intervened outside Russia, since the breakup, starting from Georgia and until Ukraine, was the reason that Mr. Putin was, Russians were always intervening for the protection of Russian population, whether it's Georgia, whether it's elsewhere, in Ukraine, everywhere. So that is a natural factor for the local population to support such kind of intervention outside, because ethnic Russians are being protected, and that was a point not really mentioned. The second thing that relates with the situation inside Russia is that economy and not ideology exists today. And Russian economy consistently has been going down. Oil prices have been one factor, but there have been other factors as well. Russian arms, yeah, I'm just very, very precise. Russian arms sales have gone down more or less in Asia because of Chinese cheaper and more sophisticated weapons. So unless you have ideology, which is not there, economy is not strong, Russia can face serious consequences going beyond the Russian ethnic population and trying to save them.
Thank you.
Last quick note.
That's enough. Thank you. Thank you. We have to get other questions. Yes, over there.
أبو بكر عبد الرازق
Abu Bakr Abdul Razak
من الدوحة للدراسات العليا.
from Doha Institute for Higher Studies, Political Studies. I would like to focus on a specific point. I think that the first two speakers did not highlight this issue. The intervention of Russia in 2008 in Georgia was based on the invitation of NATO for Georgia to join the alliance. And then the Russian intervention in Ukraine 2014 was based on the NATO's movement towards the Eastern European countries, dividing or separating NATO countries from Russia. So Russia has intervened for the first time based on the security and interest of Russia outside its own borders and outside its direct interests. Why intervening in Syria and supporting the Syrian regime? I think that Russia is trying to take further advanced steps and protecting its interests by keeping the Syrian regime in order to guarantee negotiation points against other countries that are imposing economic sanctions on Russia in order to put an end to the current internal crisis. I expect something to happen in the future when it comes to the intervention of Russia in the Middle East. Russia can do away with the Syrian regime if it gets guarantees that the West and European countries and the US in particular will stop trying to isolate Russia. So the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan and the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan. During these days, Afghanistan was a rural society, was an agricultural society, a peaceful society. However, the people had the courage, and the Soviet Union intervened, and they installed a communist party and tried to impose Marxism and Leninism. They wanted to teach them the communist principle. This is why the people went crazy, and the Muslims in the world went crazy, and Afghanistan became a jihadist land. Russia then created a scene for the jihadis of the world, and now Russia is intervening once again after having killed through its weapons 300,000 Syrians by protecting the Syrian regime, whether in the Security Council or not. Now Russia is fighting with who? It is fighting and protecting the Shia militia and the Alawite militia. The Syrian army of the regime today is an Alawite militia that is protecting specific cities. Rastan is being bombarded, Raqqa, and Homs. The regime was thrown outside of this region, but Russia is supporting the regime. The Russians support the regime that is sending out 10 million Syrians from their country. Bashar al-Assad is responsible for these crimes. The question is addressed to Mr. Victor Mizin and Mr. Sergei Strokan. You are convinced as researchers that this regime is legitimate. Are you? do you believe in the results of the presidential elections? 99.9%. Do you believe in that democracy? Do you think that this is a legitimacy that inherited this regime, like inheriting some fields or some rural areas? You are talking about the interests of Russia, and Russia has the right to come to our countries. You are not talking about our victims, the children that were killed, the millions of refugees all over the world. This amazes me. I am talking with you as academics and researchers. Bashar al-Assad at the beginning talked and said that there will be no revolution in Syria. He had several expectations, and he said that there will be several wars. Like, for example, do you think that the Islamic State is a projection, or it was prepared by the intelligence? We feel in Syria that Daesh or ISIS is supported by international countries. Why do we see ISIL when there were dictatorships? Before Sisi in Egypt, there was no ISIS. But after putting aside Morsi, but after ousting Morsi, with the support of the Sisi, so the Russians supporting Sisi because he's similar to the regime. Why we don't have ISIL in Morocco? Your policy is the other face of Daesh, of ISIL. You are the real ISIL.
I would thank the panel for this presentation. My name is Ammar Hamoudeh. I want to say that you gentlemen said that you are afraid of any kind of suddenly step down of Bashar al-Assad, because you are afraid of instability and terrorism. And here I would ask you, what instability and terrorism could expect more than that? What do you expect more than that till now? This is the first thing. The second thing that we have, and we can refer to the Chechnya example, because at that time, that even the Aslan Maskhadov and even the Dodiev, that they all assassinated by the Russian forces, because the Russian always consider all the oppositions as a terrorism. This is the second point. And then the third point, which is the last point, I want to say to Mr. Emmanuel that you said that Russia didn't do nothing more than the US. Do you think as an academic that this is a justification of this kind of intervention and killing many of innocent in Syria? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Hasan Özerten from Turkey. I have two questions. One of them for Professor Marwan. He elaborated on the differences between Israel and Iran's cooperation with Russia as Middle Eastern actors. May you elaborate more on these issues further? And my question goes to my Russian counterparts. They said that Russia is afraid of the ISIS threat as a terrorist threat. But up until now, we have seen an Afghan threat, and a great terrorism threat in Afghanistan, which is also affecting Central Asia, affecting Chechnya problem in deep. But Russia preferred to step aside and just watch the international community's intervention there, and chose to not direct intervention. What's the difference between Afghan problem and Syrian problem for Russian foreign policy? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Last one over there. آخر واحد.
Taysir Al-Adawi, university professor. Please give me 3 minutes. You have 1 minute. I need 3 minutes, or I will remain silent. I want to answer the Russian researchers. I am amazed to see the Russians defending this intervention. I want to talk about do you have something to say that is direct? 2 minutes. 2 minutes. Okay. I am very sorry to see Russian academics defending the Russian media and the demagogy, saying that the Russian intervention is moral, to support the people against the U.S. hegemony, to defend Assad or safety or the peace of this region and a positive international environment. Throughout history, there was always reality and there was always statements. Russia's intervention is not the first, it's the fifth in the Levant. The first was in 1839. After the request of the Ottoman Khalifa Mahmud al-Thani to the Russian Tsar to defend the Ottoman Empire. Of course, Russia did not want to defend the Ottoman Empire. However, it was a pretext to invade Syria against Muhammad Ali Pasha's army. And Russia lost, the Ottomans lost, Muhammad Ali Pasha lost the Battle of Nasibain, and then the second intervention was in Damascus, 1854, 1860, a month of Lebanon to defend the minorities, and also it was a failure. The third intervention was during the Sykes-Picot Agreement. It wanted to annex the Ottoman states, and it wanted influence in the north of Kurdistan, and it wanted some influence to the Orthodox Church, and it did not achieve so. And now we see the same justification, the same scenario asked by the current regime. Russia is intervening. I would like this conference to reiterate that Russia did not intervene for a principle or a dogma or values or moral values or to defend sovereignty or to fight IS. These are all lies. Russia wants to establish its position at the international scene. This is why there should be another front to put an end to this Russian ambition. Thank you.
How many minutes? 2 minutes. Okay. Each or okay. Let me first with the question of Pakistani colleague. Well, in fact, thank you for that question. You took it from my mouth because I found that what was missing in our discussion was just trying to put that Russia's operation in Syria in the context of Russia's domestic political agenda, which is very, very important. Let me just give you the latest statistic, which came even surprising to me. Yesterday, we had revealed the latest opinion poll conducted by FCOM, Russia's leading polling survey station, which, can you imagine, revealed that in recent week, President Putin's popularity skyrocketed to 90%. 90%. Before that, it was very high, but still it was 83. And let me just recall you that in 1999, when Putin was still an enigma to the world, the American journalist became world famous when she asked the famous question, "Who is Mr. Putin?" No one knew about him. You see, everybody was laughing and saying, this is not a serious person. And during that time, the world has seen the photographs of President Putin as a pilot MiG. You see, and you know the time of Chechnya war. So really, this is very important instrument to secure, to consolidate Russian public opinion, all this drum beating about patriotism, about defending Russia's interests, Russia's being strong, even when the weak economy, as you said. That's very interesting thing. Also, those opinion polls, they show very conflicting results. More and more Russians are really believing in the economy. There's a feeling even of despair, but at the same time, it doesn't touch popularity of Putin. So he is divine, he is immune. So prime minister can be bad, ministers can be bad, oligarchs can be bad, but not him. So that's why, you see, this is erroneous assumption that if we have worsened economic situation, it will lead to the erosion of President Putin's popularity. Paradoxically enough, the worst economic situation is the more his popularity is, because all of those things. Regarding these parallels with Georgia and NATO, yes, and Ukraine, yeah. Well, you know, obviously Georgia and Ukraine are not Syria, but what is common is that we have to see for the balance between security and political interests. This is what is in common. Regarding Afghanistan, well, that's a tricky issue. Regarding, there was just attempts to draw comparison between Afghanistan and Syria. Friends, there's one striking difference. In Syria, we don't have boots on the ground operation. Let me repeat it again. We don't have boots on the ground operations. So we don't want coffins coming from Syria. We don't want our soldiers captured in Syria. That's why till today we have airstrikes only, and Russian leadership makes itself clear that there will be no any ground troops located here. As far as our Turkish friend's question of why Russia is not acting against Taliban, really this is a very tough question. Well, I can tell you that really before this operation, probably those events in Afghanistan, which are also quite dramatic, they were overshadowed by the Syrian operation, and you know, the capture of Kunduz came as a wide opener for Americans as well. But I would not say that Russia is not doing there also. Just days before Kunduz, Tajik President Rahmon rushed to Sochi to President Putin, and they had a meeting there, and there were leaks that Rahmon was asking for President Putin also to beef up security in this region. So it would be wrong to say that Russia is not doing anything there as well, because it's their backyard, and it's pretty close to our borders. You see, Tajikistan-Afghan border, so this is Russia's soft belly. But at the same time, of course, you're right that the question comes up, and this probably shows that what is at stake in Syria is not fighting terrorists as such, but to send the image to the world. And regarding your question about legitimacy, so you're very passionate, emotional. I understand emotions are running high. Whether we consider Assad regime to be legitimate or not, well, I would say in a nutshell, from my point of view, this is a question of, I would define it as questionable legitimacy. Because formally, we have all, features of legitimacy. They had elections, he is formally a legitimate leader, but at the same time, it's an open secret that President Assad crossed the red line many times. So we know what he has done to opposition. We know what's going on in Syrian cities. That's why Russia is speaking about political process. Believe me, if Russia fully would be happy with this type of questionable or handicapped or lame duck legitimacy, there would be no talk about political process. So de facto, Russia understands that. And finally, very passionate comment was that we are defending here Russia. We are not defending anyone. This is a seminar. This is not a political talk show. This is the place where leading intellectuals just sharing their opinions. We're not taking sides, but we are analyzing, and we want to find where the truth is. Thank you.
Well, my friend was so eloquent. I have just a few remarks regarding NATO and the invitation. Actually, what was done in Istanbul in '99, it was not invitation, it was the possibility for Georgia and Ukraine. And of course, Russia is always guided by its security interests, what it considers the area with its vital security interests. It's basically all post-Soviet area. And it's the same in Syria, because I would argue the ISIL is the major problem. It's regarded as a terrorist force which beheads innocent people, kills already thousands and thousands of people. I'm not trying here to fend off what Assad's regime is doing. I'm speaking about ISIL. And I quoted, it wasn't my words, I just wanted to say what is the official Russian position, that our major goal is to eliminate and completely neutralize ISIL and to prevent ISIL's militants coming to Russia to commit terrorist acts, which they already have been planning and were apprehended there. And I don't think that, of course, for Russia, what is important, it's become, as we said here, a major global player, game changer, major actor in the Middle East. But I don't think, as my friend, leading American criminologist Robert Legwood said, you could do whatever you please with Russia if you show some respect. It's very important, yeah? Because after the third shot of vodka, I mean, the major question in Russia is, do you respect me? It's very important. But I don't think that, for example, that even if the West and European Union and NATO show to Mr. Putin, yeah, you are equal, there are no double standards, we recognize you, that Russia would leave Assad, because it's also very important for Russia to show that it's a reliable partner, a consistent patron, which is patronizing and helping, aiding whom it considers its allies for the moment. Although, once again, I am to say, in Syria, we're not supporting Assad regime. It's not my words, it's Putin's words. We're fighting against terrorism there. Once again, about legitimacy, you know, it's very tricky issue, or like what Sergei said, imitation democracy. You can say the same about Russia and 90% of Putin's popularity, whether it's hoax, how real it is. Coming to Afghanistan and jihadism that Russia produced, jihadism. Yeah, I mean, I knew better than anyone else. It was a KGB ploy that they imposed on Politburo and Brezhnev, saying that Americans are to invade Afghanistan, that Amin was their agent, and to place Tomahawk missiles there, which could attack Russia. And then, of course, this idiotic idea of bringing socialism to Iraqi soil. Then what was the response? It was the Wilson War. It was, I mean, many militants, Islamic militants, financed by United States, what actually created the Taliban. At least it's the Russian reading. And of course, Russia was gloating when Americans invaded after September 9/11, invaded Afghanistan in response to terrorist attacks, thinking it's your war. At least for the moment, I remember it was the talks, I was in the foreign ministry, that Russia was ready for airstrikes there. Now, when Americans are leaving, I think stupidly, and it's a great fiasco, yeah, no success, and Taliban is winning and coming closer to Russia. And of course, we were helping, as it was mentioned here, Americans with this hub or military base and, you know, this traffic of military equipment through Russia. Many times we asked Americans for cooperation in the fight against drugs, because it's a major route which is a threat to Russia and Western Europe as well. There was no response. So now, once again, when Taliban is coming closer to Tajikistan, which is basically protected by Russian troops, yeah, this famous brigade, Russia once again is contemplating, and probably the next area of airstrikes could be Afghanistan if Taliban would start incursions into Syria.
Just as I know that Hassan was asking about the trio, Russia, Iran, Israel, I think, and I said that during my intervention, that Iran, while it is an ally in more than one issue, it is at the same time a competitor to Russia in more than one issue. And if we all go back to the Ukraine crisis, Iran was present itself as a substitute for the gas and petroleum for Europe. And despite the interest between Russia and Iran, Russia does not want Iran to be so big and in a way that will be an influential regional power in the region. We know that the Russian position was always closer to the West during the nuclear talks. That's why Russia never wanted Iran to become a nuclear power. And this was clear in the talks, nuclear talks. As for Israel, I think that we all know that Netanyahu obtained an appointment from Netanyahu in 2 days after the Russian intervention. On the 13th of September, the intervention began, and on the 2nd of October, Putin met Putin. And the only country that Russia coordinated with, militarily speaking, was Israel only. That was even before the coordination between Russia and USA. And even before that, Putin, the first city or country he visited after becoming president in 2012, May 2012, was Israel. The first country he visited when he became president was Israel. This is a sign or an indication how deep the relation between Putin and Netanyahu. And we can even add to that that Netanyahu and Putin have the same vision or the way they look upon Barack Obama. They agree about their ideas about Barack Obama. Thank you very much. We thank all the speakers and those who contributed to this session, which I think was very important and reflected the points of view of Moscow. And I think the other sessions will be replying or responding to this session. So it was a very good session. Thank you very much.